Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Huberman. Andrew is a neuroscientist. He's a neurobiology professor at Stanford Medical School, a McKnight Foundation and Pew Foundation Fellow, and the founder of Huberman Lab, where he's involved in all kinds of really amazing breakthrough research on brain function, brain plasticity, and brain regeneration. His work has been published in top journals like Nature. He's been featured in publications like Time, Scientific American, the BBC. And he's here today to discuss the brain, to discuss growth mindset, how to focus, how to navigate these stressful times, and many other subjects. It's an incredible conversation. I think you guys are going to enjoy it. I appreciate you watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. And without further ado, this is me and Dr. Andrew Huberman. First of all, thanks for doing this. I appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Long time coming. I'm glad we're doing it in person and not remotely. And I think what I want to do is start with your origin story, because you're your path is very unlikely. Your path to becoming a scientist, and I think it actually also kind of contextualizes some of the things that I want to talk about with you today. So maybe start there.
Sure. So on the one hand, maybe I was fated to become a scientist. I guess the two things that are relevant there are, I always loved animals, and I've always been obsessed with animal behavior. Like, just could watch Cousteau shows growing up, underwater life or animals hunting, animals doing anything is just so fascinating to me, because I think even at a really young age, I've always just been intrigued in sort of what drives different animals to behave in the way they do, and how body form matches to, I didn't know what it was, but brains and how that all works. So I've always been obsessed with animals. And then my dad's a scientist. So he's a physicist. Was really early in chaos theory. And so growing up in our home, we had scientists over for dinner, and graduate students would come over for barbecues and things like that.
Is he a Stanford professor?
He was at Stanford. He was mostly at Xerox PARC, which is kind of famous. If you read the Steve Jobs book, is for the development of the GUI interface, the graphical user interface, and sort of early days of the computer. So he had a lab there, and he had a lab in applied physics at Stanford, and something called symbolic systems, which is a Stanford degree in kind of ecology and computation, that kind of thing. So I grew up in this family where science was very prominent, and we had lots of discussions in our home that I would overhear and I didn't understand about physics. And we'd spend summers at the Aspen Center for Physics, which was like
good times.
Yeah.
As
so,
a kid.
and we were, and to be clear, you hear the word Aspen, we were a middle-class family, but they have this Aspen Center for Physics. So the Feynman, Richard Feynman was there, Murray Gell-Mann, like all these luminaries of physics, Peter Kaus. And my dad was really good at telling me the stories about these guys, and then I'd always want to meet them. And it was mostly guys back then. There weren't many women in physics. So I was kind of immersed in science from a young age. But right about age 13, my parents split up, and he moved overseas. He moved to Denmark, and my mom was really struggling with the breakup. And I wasn't in contact with him anymore. So I had this really unusual childhood where, we didn't talk about sports, we talked about science. And I had this close relationship with science and the people around science. But then all of a sudden, the structure around family, instead of dinners together every night, it was just like me and my mom. And I was an adolescent, and I was hitting puberty. So, there was bound to be some shifts in my world landscape and internal landscape anyway. But basically what happened was I stopped really paying attention to school, and I got really heavily into skateboarding and kind of punk rock music. And I found my pack or my community through like a pack and community of kids that also just were kind of parentless. So this was like late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And so at a pretty young age, I started I grew up in Palo Alto. I was actually born at Stanford Hospital. And started taking the 7F bus up to San Francisco and hanging around in Embarcadero. For the skateboarders out there, the listeners, this is the now famous EMB crowd. So this was the birth of a huge movement of skateboarders that became professionals. So you'd see the young Danny Way would come through town, or you had Rob Dyrdek, I remember when he came through. So all these names that eventually became popular during the kind of X Games era, but at that time it was really underground. And so it was this pack of maybe 100 guys and it was run like a little city, and it was chaos. It was like there was fights and there was drinking and there was lawlessness. There was also a lot of amazing skateboarding.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of amazing people, and there were some older guys, like one in particular, a very famous skateboarder is this kid, Mike Carroll. His older brother was kind of like the older brother to everybody, kind of kept us all in check. So it had its own unique organization. And it's actually interesting because the same thing was happening at that time in Washington Square Park in New York and at Love Park in Philadelphia. There were all these like communities of kids that were basically parentless. And so in that time, I saw some interesting things. First of all, I learned what it was to be parentless. Growing up in Palo Alto, it was like soccer games and AYSO and, you know, swim club. And all of a sudden I realized, you know, I don't have to be home at any particular time, or, you know, none of these kids are going to school. And so it was a kind of big group of truants. And it was interesting because it gave me a perspective that I had never had in Palo Alto. And I was drifting further and further away from any kind of academic rigor.
Right.
I think I would go to school every once in a while.
What's mom doing? Does she have any idea that you're going up to the city every day?
So she was totally checked out.
Wow.
You know, I think she was just devastated by a bunch of things that were happening. And she lapsed into a pretty serious depression. And then in that community, what was interesting is I started seeing that, you know, some guys were clearly fated to becoming professional skateboarders. They were really good at it. I just want to say, for full disclosure, I was not particularly good. I kept getting injured. I was not fated to be, you know, exceptional or very good at it. But I love the camaraderie and I love the community. But I also noticed that, you know, some people were drinking all day and other people got into hard drugs, and people started to, you know, some of the dysfunction really started to show up.
Yeah, the fracture.
Yeah, the fracture
begins.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, and I started seeing that a lot more violence. You know, people started getting their girlfriends pregnant. They didn't have money to support those kids. You know, it started becoming apparent to me that there was a lot of dysfunction as well as a lot of incredible people in that community. And so, about that time, I got a girlfriend. And the other thing was I got removed from high school. So I went to kind of the famed / infamous high school in Palo Alto, Gunn High School.
Oh, you went to Gunn?
I went to Gunn, which is famous because it's one of the most academically rigorous schools in the, you know, country, maybe the planet. People move to the area just to send their kids there. But it also has this very complicated reputation as the high suicide rate of any school in the country. The New York Times has written about this. So, you know, I would come to school every once in a while, but I could tell you far more about the curbs in the front of the Gunn High School parking lot than I could about anything that I learned at Gunn.
Yeah. So when they say you were removed, I mean, you were expelled.
No, basically they just said you need to either start coming to school or, you know, you're done. So I got shifted to another high school, and that was the same story. It was a mess. It just fell apart. And so at one point, I was brought in, I have a kind of vague recollection of this, but I was brought in to have a discussion with a school counselor. And I don't think I've ever told this story before. And there was someone sitting in the corner. This guy was sitting in the corner, and he didn't introduce himself. And pretty soon I realized, I was like, I think they're gonna take me away. Like I started to realize, because they realized my mom wasn't really able to control me, wasn't really in a place to support me. At that time. And that's what they did. They took me away. They took me to a place up the peninsula, which was not a jail, and it wasn't a hospital. It was just sort of a place where they put kids that were
like some kind of juvie warehousing situation.
Yeah, a lot of psychologists, a lot of locks on doors, a lot of kids that there were 12 of us in there at any one time. It was locked down. And the first night there, I remember I had a roommate who was like really into cutting on himself, that kind of thing. And he told me, he's like, look, if you just do what they say here, you'll be out of here in like a month. And if you don't, you're gonna be here a very long time. And I remember being pretty frightened for the first time. And at that point, I was like, oh my goodness, like, this is bad. You know, like this is bad. I'm a long way.
It's so hard for me to imagine,
I know. And
this given, you know, who you are and what you do now.
I know. And, you know, and it was literally like the kind of one phone call a day kind of thing. So actually I was skateboarding for a company in San Francisco. I think they put me on out of sympathy. And I called this guy up and I said, look, they locked me up. I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And I'll never forget. I won't say his name. He goes, you're the most normal guy I know. he's like
the least likely of that crowd
exactly.
for that to happen.
So in any event, I was permitted to go back to school eventually, provided that I went to therapy. And so I started going to weekly therapy, which in the early 90s was kind of a weird thing. You wouldn't admit it to your friends. But so we'd skateboard around Stanford campus. I was doing my thing. And then twice a week, I would go in and see this therapist. He's a remarkable guy because he had deep training in the mind, right? And we started talking about what was going on. And he really picked up on the fact that there was essentially no structure, no home life for me, but that I had a strong drive and I was really interested in learning. I mean, I was enthusiastic and motivated enough to, skateboard as hard as I could, even though I wasn't going to go anywhere with it. So at that point, and the fact that I had a girlfriend, I started looking for something that I could do. And I started, at one point I thought I'd join the fire service because it seemed like the camaraderie was good. At that point, I started strengthening my body a bit because I didn't want to keep getting hurt. So I started running, I started lifting weights. A football coach at Gunn, actually, turned me on to fitness. It's actually an interesting guy. He wrote the script for that movie, Mr. Mom. Do you remember that movie?
Oh my God.
Yeah. Because his wife bet him that bizarre. He couldn't do what she could do, which was stay home with the kids. And he was this big, strong football coach. And so he made her a bet and he lost. And so he wrote that script. Michael Keaton played the, So he taught me, he was like, look, you can't even do a pull-up. You need to start doing your pull-ups. You need to start running, and he said the fire service might be good for you. So I was spinning out, but there were people that were willing to kind of, point me in the right direction. So what ended up happening was my high school girlfriend went off to college and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I actually went and I lived in the parking lot outside her dormitory. I just wanted to be near her. She was my family at that point.
A college locally or?
She was at UC Santa Barbara.
Oh, so you drove down and?
I just drove down. Wow. I just camped out in the parking lot and I was starting to get into some martial arts and Thai boxing then. So I think I was teaching some Thai boxing self-defense stuff on campus and doing this kind of thing. And by the end of that year, I realized that I should probably apply to college. So I applied to UCSB and somehow I got in. Lord knows how I got in. Because I did eventually graduate high school, barely. Got in, and then after a year, I just completely flailed it. I wasn't going to class. I was getting into fights. A lot of that kind of mischief and kind of wildness was still in me. And what ended up happening was I got into a physical altercation on July 4th, 1994 with like a bunch of guys. And at the end of that, I walked back to the place I was staying. And of course, I wasn't paying rent because I had learned in those years, like, you can just squat in an empty house. So, it's Isla Vista, California, so I was really running wild and went back and I realized, I was like, this picture is really bad. At some point, this isn't going to be like a kid who had some problems. This is going to be truly.
It's not cute anymore.
It's not cute anymore.
No one's going to make excuses about your upbringing or the lack of parenting. It just becomes, you're going to end up being a ward of the state. I mean, it sounds like you were almost a feral animal.
Totally feral, actually. And I have some close friends that's how they refer to me. They're
really?
Like, feral. And it's funny, even to this day, I mean, I'll get to where this eventually took me, but even to this day, when I go into a home where it's clearly like a loving home where there's kids are happy and there's good food and it's warm and cozy, I always feel this thing like, wow, like amazing. I sort of want to be adopted by them immediately. But I'm 45 years old, so that's not appropriate at this age.
What's so interesting, I keep thinking about David Epstein's book, Range. Did you read this book? Which is basically this thesis that some of the most successful people are not, we suspect that, the great talents of the world across all disciplines are the people who discover their passion at an early age and practice it voraciously for many, many, many years. But in fact, it's people more like yourself who've dabbled in all different kinds of things, who end up being ultimately, the most proficient at their selected skill set. And when I look at your experience, I see trauma, I see adventure, I see, all these obstacles that you had to face and overcome and manage on your own, essentially, right? And all of those really inform perfectly the things that you're interested in and what you explore today in your lab.
Yeah, it really did. I think that I'm so grateful for those years. I wouldn't wish them on any kid, because I think having a secure, loving environment at home is so key. And, I should say about a third of the kids that I grew up with in that environment, that whole skateboarding punk rock culture, about a third have gone on to found companies or professional skateboarders. About a third just kind of drifted off, and about a third are dead or incarcerated.
Yeah.
A huge number. And so there's real value in having a support system, that's clear. But it exposed me to all these things like addiction, schizophrenia, rage, like all of these incredible elements. Like I was never really into drinking and drugs. I could drink or not drink. It just wasn't, I wasn't drawn to it. But other people, they took one sip and it was like, that was their thing. Right. It was like the magic elixir for them. And so, I was observing what was happening. And then after that, that July 4th, 94 incident I realized this is it. It's now or never. It really was one of those moments. You hear about those moments, but it was me realizing I'm living in this squat. I've got a pet ferret. My girlfriend's gone. She broke up with me. She was smart enough to break up with me. I'm getting in fights. I'm working at a bagel shop. I'm barely making ends meet. And at that point, I just made the decision. I just said, okay, look, I'm not going to be a professional athlete. I think I'm pretty good at memorizing things. I think I have an interest in people. I'm going to just decide. I just decided to do school. I decided that was the track. So like some people pick the military because it's like if you know what to expect, at least in terms of the passages that you're going to go through. And for me, that was school. And so I had decided to get back in school. I moved into a studio apartment by myself. I quit partying completely. I didn't go to parties. I got really serious about fitness. So I just started running and lifting weights. And I studied.
You went like Henry Rollins style.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
That's a lot of self-awareness. People go into the military because on some level, some people do because there's some yearning for having that structure imposed upon their lives. But you constructed that kind of structure for yourself.
Yeah, I think I was really afraid. I think I was like, and these days, because my lab studies fear and I get into this whole thing around mindsets, people always ask me like, is it better to do something from a place of love or fear? Like, it depends. And at that point, fear was the best motivator for me. And I just basically worked like crazy. And it's interesting because I didn't have a mentor or someone to bring me to that. But once I started doing that, there was one professor in particular who took note. He was like, oh, you seemed really interested in this stuff. And I was like, yeah, because he was teaching me about depression, schizophrenia, neurochemicals. I thought I was totally turned on by the world of neuroscience. It wasn't even called neuroscience back then, but this one guy, Harry Carlisle, he was teaching me about thermal regulation and how the brain works and how receptors in the skin relate to perceptions in the mind. And he also had a deep sensitivity to mental disease. And I'd seen a lot of that. I'd seen a lot of depression and anxiety in my own family. I'd had a friend commit suicide. Another friend becomes schizophrenic. I think he's still walking the Mission District of San Francisco now. Seen some friends become addicts. And so here was someone explaining that there's actually an underlying basis for this. And I just poured myself into it.
Is that the same guy who would smoke underneath the vacuum hood and stuff like that, like a bit of an iconoclast?
Yeah, he was amazing. So he was a favorite teacher of many students, but if you could get into his lab, then you were kind of one of the chosen ones, I guess.
He's like the perfect mentor at the perfect time for you.
Yeah, so he used to drink coffee in lab, which you're not supposed to do. He used to smoke cigarettes in lab and in the fume hood, and they used to come and yell at him, and he would do it anyway. And I thought, this guy, he doesn't even know what it is, but he's punk rocker, he doesn't even know. And so, he gave me an opportunity to work in his lab, and then at some point he told me, if you go to graduate school, they'll actually pay you to do science. And what ended up happening at that point was I hit a brick wall because I had a lot of resentment toward my dad. I felt, here's my dad. He was a scientist. He had, left us, all this kind of thing. And I realized if I didn't do this, if I didn't take this opportunity, it was going to be the most foolish thing ever. What am I going to do? Spite my, my parents? Because, I was 20 years old at that point. So I just made the decision. I'm going to get a PhD. I'm going to become a professor. I'm going to get tenure. I'm going to be like this guy. This guy who looked like he had a pretty good life to me. And so that's pretty much how I spent the last 25 years of my life is doing experiments.
It worked out.
It worked out. It was a lot of work. I didn't have the power of concentration. I hadn't read all the good books that gun high school students read growing up. I had to learn how to speak properly. I learned how to learn how to think properly and really learn how to commit to something that was very linear and at times was very painful. And I went to some pretty extreme things. I actually used to set a timer, and I wouldn't allow myself to get out of the chair until the timer went off.
Right.
So, and I would experience extreme agitation. But over time, I got pretty good, and now I can do long stints of work without any breaks. And it worked out.
You developed that neuroplasticity in your favor, ultimately. You were always a reader, though, right?
I loved books. So I would, I would hide in the Tower Books section in the evenings, and I would read everything about fitness, psychology, anything I could. I've always devoured information. My favorite book when I was a kid was the Encyclopedia or the Guinness Book of World Records. So I would, when I was a little kid, I'd walk around the Aspen Center for Physics and I would tell anyone. I didn't even ask them if they wanted to hear about what's the world's smallest eutherian mammal. I would it could tell you all these facts that were kind of meaningless at the time, but I've always been fascinated by the inventory of different animals on the planet and their different behaviors. And so, voracious reader, and still now.
Yeah,
I love information.
Well, as a neuroscientist, I mean, you're your own patient. I mean, the fact that you were able to, turn your life around in such a dramatic fashion and do it essentially through sheer will and, setting up practices that would fuel you in that right direction, and then being available when those mentors showed up from the early therapist. Sounds like that guy almost saved your life.
He absolutely saved my life. Yeah. He gave me the book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, the Jon Kabat-Zinn book. And he said, no pressure, but if you can develop a mindfulness practice where you can sit still for 10 minutes a day, it'll serve you very well. So I started doing that. He could have told me to hang out of a window by my ankles. I would have done it. I think there was a self-preservation thing was kicking in for me. So I got very interested in mindfulness meditation. He also, it was, I think, quite smart in saying, look, there's a whole world of psychedelic drugs that are powerful in influencing the mind. He said, if you're going to explore those, wait until your brain has already developed, which I think is a controversial statement in and of itself. He actively discouraged me to go down that path, which I think was the right thing, given I was a minor, And nowadays there's all this discussion now about psychedelics and their power, and I think they are very interesting compounds. But he really steered me towards behavioral practices. What could I do each day from waking up to going to sleep that would serve my mental health and my productivity well?
Right.
Yeah, I owe him a tremendous amount, and especially because he wasn't just in the psychoanalytic theory, he also was cognitive behavioral. He understood the power of practices, not just discussing issues.
Yeah, to begin a meditation practice at that age in the mid-90s, that's pretty radical.
Yeah, I felt it was funny because I thought if I didn't sit in the lotus position, I wasn't doing it properly. Back then there was all this stuff around it. It was very mystical. And in my family, because my dad's very conservative and my mom's a little bit more of a free spirit, I was taught that anything that related to hippie culture was doomed to fail and cause problems. And that anything that was related to conservative